Welcome to the HTML5 Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your instructor, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about styling elements part 1. So this is going to be a multi-part tutorial series about styling elements in HTML. Now I know this is a course on HTML and HTML5, but in order for us to build our websites we need to have a basic knowledge of some of CSS for our site to look a little bit more presentable. CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, is the styling language that we use to style the structure of our web pages. HTML is for content, and CSS is for styling. And actually, HTML is for structure also, because it's how we structure our pages. We talked about normal document flow and the structure of our web pages. We use HTML for content and structure. CSS is for styling of those pages. In a nutshell, the selector of a rule set identifies the HTML elements that the styling rule will apply to. I know that may sound a little confusing, but in a few minutes you're going to see how when we take a selector, we can assign it styles in CSS, and then those styles will pertain to anything in our HTML file that has that selector. So let's drop into our development environment. To better explain what we're discussing, keep in mind that a section of the website is devoted to CSS and CSS3. And for the most up-to-date information on CSS and how to properly style using CSS, you actually should refer to that portion of the website that's dedicated to the CSS and CSS3 styling languages. These tutorials, the next couple of tutorials for the HTML section, are going to be just a basic overview of how we use CSS inside of our HTML document so that you can get through these HTML tutorials. For a really in-depth knowledge of some CSS, go look at the CSS portion of the website. CSS was introduced together with HTML4 to provide a more efficient way to style HTML elements. CSS can be added to HTML documents in 3 different ways. We can have inline, using the style attribute in HTML elements to actually style inline with the element, and we talked about attributes in a previous tutorial. We can use internal styling using the style element in the head section of our HTML document, and we're going to demonstrate that as well as the inline in a few minutes. And external. We can actually use external style sheets to style our website. So there's 3 different ways that we can implement CSS styling language into our HTML documents. All 3 of these we're going to review in this series of tutorials. The preferred way is to use the external style sheet, but we'll look at all 3 ways in these future demonstrations in the next few tutorials so that you understand how all 3 work in reference to your HTML documents. So let's go ahead and move into our development environment, set that up, and let's demonstrate some of the things that we've just talked about. Alright, so as we do in all our tutorials, the first thing I want to do is confirm that we've got our environment up and running as it should be. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize my presentation. And I want to go and make certain that we've got our Apache web server. Our XAMPP is up and running with my PHP running, my PHP and MySQL. That's running and doing as it needs to be done, which we want that running for all our tutorials. That's how we actually go ahead and test our configurations. The next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and show you the root structure that I have for the directories in the root directory of my website for this particular tutorial. This is my styling elements tutorial. I've got a CSS directory created because we're going to use that not in part 1, but we will be using it in part 2. And I've got my images directory. I don't think we're going to be using it in this particular tutorial, but I've got it there with my placeholder images. And this is where we'll be storing those files that we're going to create. So we've got our directory structure created and explained. Let's go and make certain that we've got our browser window up, which is the browser that we're actually in the directory structure of that web root for our styling elements tutorial. And I'm going to bring up my Sublime text editor, which is the editor that I'll be using for this tutorial, with a blank document on the screen. Alright, so let's go ahead and create our basic template that we're going to use for this tutorial series. I'm going to go ahead to my exercise file, example number 1. I'm going to go ahead and cut that or copy that. I'm going to go ahead and paste that into my text there. Let's make sure that our word rep is on. And it is. That's good. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. We want to save this as the basic template.html inside that styling elements folder. Okay, so we got that saved. Let's go ahead and refresh our screen. And this would be a great time. Let me go ahead and get this position correct. This would be a great time for you to pause and type this in if you need to. Let me go ahead and scroll down so you can get the rest of the document. And again, good time for you to pause and type that in if you need to. Let's go ahead and load that document up in our browser window, and you'll see we basically just have our HTML document, no markup, no CSS reset. We're just getting ready to actually demonstrate some inline styling using the inline styling features of CSS. Okay, so let's look at how to code some basic selectors using CSS, how we're going to style some basic selectors. Let's demonstrate the different types of styling before we begin. We're actually going to start with our inline styles, but remember from our presentation we have three types of styling. We can do inline styles, internal styles, and external styles. So first we're going to demonstrate the inline styles in CSS. And inline styles are good if a unique style is needed to be applied to one single occurrence of an element inside your HTML document. When using inline styles in HTML, we use a style attribute in the tag that we're wishing to style. So if you remember from the previous tutorial, we actually talked about attributes. Well, all tags in CSS have a styling attribute. And that's what we do when we try to apply inline styles to our documents. We're actually using that style attribute from the element inside the HTML. So the style attribute can contain any CSS property that's part of the CSS styling language. And using the style attribute, let's style one of our paragraph tags. So what I'm going to do, let's go ahead and scroll down a little bit in our sample document, our sample HTML document. I'm going to go ahead and open up that paragraph tag, and I'm going to grab an example I've got in our example files. And inside that paragraph tag, let's go ahead and put in a styling element. And notice I've got style equals, and then I've got my color :blue with a semicolon. Then I've got a space, margin left, 20 pixels, semicolon. So I'm actually putting margin on the left of 20 pixels. I'm changing the color of my text to blue, and I'm actually assigning a font size of 1.2 ems. And you'll notice that that entire styling for that style element is enclosed in quotation marks, double quotation marks. So it's style, that's the attribute, equals, and then my three styles that I'm going to save here. Let's go ahead and do a save as on this file. And let's save this as basic template. And actually what I want to do is let's go ahead and save this as chapter 17. _01. So it's our first example in chapter 17. Because we have quite a few examples, or a couple examples in here. So we've saved that file. Let's go back and reload it now in our browser window. So I've got to refresh to bring it up, reload it. Now you'll notice that we've got a new styling for that paragraph. First off, you'll notice that the text is in blue. I've moved it in 20 pixels from the left edge. And keep in mind we don't have our CSS reset, so we've got the default margins, whatever they happen to be for a particular Firefox browser. But I've added 20 pixels to that, so it's indented from the left. And I've got a font size of 1.2 em. And we'll get into these sizing elements later, but it's a font size that's a little bit larger than 100% of the font. So we've saved that document. There are different ways. You notice that for instance, I've actually put the color here by a word. There's a couple different ways that we can do this with colors, and we're going to have a tutorial on this. But one of the other ways is we can actually use the hexadecimal equivalent of color. And I'll use one of my favorite colors, 1C, 5C, 7, 8, and end that with a colon. These can be actually uppercase or lowercase. I tend to make them uppercase just so they say the same, they look the same as the letters. I'm going to go ahead and save that change, but you'll notice now when we save this and I refresh the browser window, it actually changes the color of that text. For anyone that doesn't recognize that color, that's the base color of the website, 1C, 5C, 7, 8. I actually like that color. It's actually a nice, to me it's a pleasant color. But we can actually use words here. We actually use the word blue. We can actually use the hexadecimal values. We can use RGB, RGBA, and we'll go through all of that stuff in future tutorials, all the different ways that we can actually put colors into our CSS. So let's look at another example. What I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and look at another example using one of my heading tags. So we're going to look at another example. We're going to change the background color of one of the heading elements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to this H1 tag, which is our major heading element, styling elements in HTML, part 1. That's this very top piece here. And I want to go ahead and change the background color, add some styling to that heading element. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing we did in the previous exercise. I'm going to add a style tag, again, inline styles. So it's style equal, open and closing quotation marks. I want to put in a background color. And again, I'm entering this the exact same way I would enter this into a CSS document, as you're going to see. And I'm going to use that 1C, 5C, 7, 8. I'm going to end that with a semicolon. I'm going to put in a space. And I'm going to say color, colon. And I'm going to put FFF, that's white. And end that with a semicolon. By the way, when I assign color here, it's actually assigning a text color. That's to actually change the color of the font. And then I'm going to say padding left. Whereas last time we used margin, this time I'm going to use padding. Stop that with a colon, and let's put in 25 pixels of padding on our left-hand side. And that with a semicolon. I want to save those changes. So what I've done is I've styled this H1 element at the very top of our browser window, styling elements in HTML part 1. And what I did with the background colors, I'm actually going to give the entire thing a background, the entire heading element. Remember, that's a block element, so it should stretch across our page as a background color for that particular heading. I want to go, let's do a save as. I want to save this as chapter 17 _02, so these are all part of the exercise files. In the event you have access to those exercise files, I want to go and save that. Let's go back and refresh our root directory. Let's load up 17 _02, and you'll see now that we've got that background color across the entire element, because that H1 element is a block element in HTML, and if I stretch it, it's going to stretch with that element, because again, it's a block level element in HTML, so it actually takes up all the vertical space that it can take inside of our HTML document. So that's just a really fast way of how to actually style some headings inside your documents. You actually give them a background color. It's used quite frequently as people are designing web pages. They actually use that quite a bit on heading elements to give them background color so they're offset from the text. Okay, so we've talked about inline styling elements. Let's go back into our presentation for a minute, because there's a couple of things I want to talk about before we look at the next part of the tutorial. In other words, part 2 of this tutorial series, where we're actually going to look at the style tag that's part of the head element of the HTML document. So let's go ahead and drop back into our presentation for a minute. Alright, so we've looked at styling using inline styles inside of our HTML document. Let's go back and review a little bit what we talked about. We talked about our inline styles. Inline styles are used in HTML, but they're not the most efficient way to style an HTML document. As you saw in the demonstrations, we have to individually style each tag using the styling attribute. So it's not very efficient. And I mean, if we had large documents, obviously we could have thousands of styles that we'd have to set in each individual tag. And just imagine if you had to go back after you've styled all those documents using those inline styles, and you wanted to change the font, or you wanted to change the font size. You have to go back and touch every one of those tags that pertain to a font size. So again, it's not a very efficient way to style things. We also saw that we can actually put a styling attribute in any of our tags, and that all the coding that's available in, or all the scripting that's available in CSS is actually available inside those style tags, those inline style tags. So any styling that I wanted to do using an inline style tag, I could actually do. It recognizes all the available CSS scripting that's available for that particular style. What we're going to look at next is we're actually going to look at using the style tag that's part of the head element of an HTML document. It's a little more efficient than what we currently demonstrated, but not near as efficient as using an external style sheet. I just want you, as the viewer, to be aware that there are different ways to style things in using CSS, and that based on what you're doing and how often it needs to be styled will determine what type of styling that you'll use. So in the next part of this tutorial, we're actually going to go and look at using the style tag that's part of the head element of an HTML document. So I hope you enjoyed part 1 of styling elements in HTML, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2.